Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we are continuing our discussion around James II, the last Catholic king of Scotland, England, and Ireland. And to continue that discussion, I have back with me the author of The Private Life of James II, Justine Brown. Welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you, Connor. Thanks for having me back on.
It's a pleasure to have you back. Do you like James II lurking behind me? He's my
We've each got one.
yeah.
I like us each to have one. Mine's a little smaller in the background, but that's the poster for the book. Ta-da!
Yes.
Which here it is. If you're
And mine is a virtual background that I managed to set up.
brilliant. It's a
Um,
famous portrait by Sir Peter Lely, who was James's favorite portraitist.
how'd you decide which picture to go with? Because
Well, I didn't get to choose outright, but the publishers asked me for a few suggestions, and I gave them three. And I was happy they chose this one, which is by John Michael Wright, who is a lesser known British Baroque artist, and we don't know for sure if he was English or Scottish, but he was. People should look his work up. He was really incredible, and somehow he's kind of lesser. He's not as famous. So I was happy they chose that one.
okay. And what is sort of the context of it? Is there anything interesting about it that stands out to you?
So it's James when he was Duke of York, which of course was his title before he acceded as the king's oldest brother. That was his title, and he was a famous warrior. So as I've talked a little bit about this before, but people should know that James was an extremely gallant and skilled warrior who was the Lord High Admiral, appointed as a small child, but he played this role. He fought and won against the Dutch. He fought as a child in the English Civil War. So he was famous as a warrior before. I mean, uh, you know, monarchs are members of the warrior caste traditionally, of course. Like and they're all, in theory, they're all warriors, but the more skilled, the better, right? So he really stood out. So that's
Now, is it seems like they get away from portraits of the militaristic kind in this period. There's not a lot of like art, depicting a king or a prince in battle. I mean, there are some. I think in the late 1600s and the early 1700s, there are ones of them on like horses, but there's not
yeah.
really anything of them like doing actual battle, like commanding, but not very often.
Well, we see this emphasis gradually melt away in the 18th century. Uh, I think in the 17th century they were still, for example, Charles I fought at the head, of an army, and they're they're usually, when they are depicted on horseback, as Charles I often was, and James has been depicted on horseback, but it's not as. Uh, I associate his horseback pictures more with the restoration, the literal restoration, when he and Charles rode into England at the head of a huge troop, and they came. They were welcomed back, which is the one historical event that I would most like to uh, witness. I'd like to be there, throwing flowers as they ride in, because it's such a wonderful moment.
Mm-hmm.
So and I remember Charles had been given a white steed by I think his horse was gray, as it had to be a little bit. And there's a wonderful traditional association between Charles in particular, and the Garland King, which is a tradition that still continues in some parts of the country. It was a nice, because Charles was, he wrote in, it was his birthday, and he was and sort of festooned with flowers, and then there's still this figure that on May 30th rides into town festooned with flowers, so you can't even see him, and that's on Oak Apple Day, which is the name they gave to the restoration. And there's like the old association between Charles and the oak tree. So um, this the Stuarts were very much consciously re-enchanting the monarchy, bringing back all possible ceremony and custom and tradition and sort of folklore. um, and they were very conscious of it, and I mean, I think it was both sincerely felt and calculated too, because they knew that the Puritans were really lacking in this department, right? Like famously, the Puritans canceled Christmas. They really did too. I mean, they,
Yep.
you know, um, they were like they opposed what they considered to be pagan rites associated with Christmas, but they opposed Christmas itself. Like they actually opposed. They thought you should just kind of think about the birth of the Savior quietly to yourself, but not celebrate it.
From
And
what I can tell is also they literally killed Pentecost, like as a holiday. I don't know if it ever recovered. Um,
that that it never came back in the
like
Protestant
yeah,
context.
like just in the English speaking world, I'm not sure Pentecost ever really uh, took its former place as a celebratory day.
That makes sense. I mean, they certainly went for Easter as well. They took all the like the
All the high feast days.
yeah, they got rid of all of those. Famously, they closed the theaters. They closed a lot of taverns. They sort of got rid of anything that smacked of the old ways and customs. And there were some interesting rebellions that happened on Christmas Day. Some actual Christmas uprisings that I mean, the uprising basically just meant that people celebrated in the old ways and got in, um, you know, cut down bits of greenery and brought it in and baked a Christmas pudding and sort of made a Christmas pudding and so forth. But then they would be cracked down on, and sometimes there was violence, and it was very intense. But
So they weren't
um,
trying to overthrow the regime or anything like
no,
on Christmas. No, just trying
not
to
directly.
celebrate Christmas.
Yeah, just trying to celebrate Christmas. And the uh, the the major generals, which is how Cromwell like broke up the country into the reign of the major generals. So each area of the country was governed by one of his major generals. But I was going to read this little bit to people from um, a a book uh, on governance, a kind of uh, um, well, it's called an English Prince, as in Machiavelli's Prince, but it was
Mm,
written by it was not called this by the author. The author is William Cavendish, who became the Duke of Newcastle. He was the Earl of Newcastle. He was he was James and Charles's tutor when he was when they were young, and he was also a famous commander during the English Civil War. And after they lost, he wrote a guidebook on governance for them to read while they were in exile in the 1650s, and while they planned on how they were going to be restored, hopefully. Although at that time it wasn't clear how that was going to happen. But he's suggested, he was very strong. Like you say, you have to play to your strengths here, and make sure that you emphasize all the old rites and traditions. So, for example, he writes. I'll just read a little bit of it, but all the old holidays with their mirth and rites set up again. There will be daily feasting in merry England, for England is so plentiful of all provisions that if we do not eat them, they will eat us. So we feast in our defense. May games, Morris dances, the lords and ladies of the Maypole, the fool, and the hobby horse must not be forgotten, and also the Whitsun lord and lady, the thrashing of hens at Shrovetide, not familiar with that one, carols and wassails at Christmas with good plum porridge and pies, which are now forbidden as profane, ungodly things. Um, the country people with their fresher lasses will trip on the town green about the maypole to the loudest bagpipes. There will to be refreshed with ale and cakes and so on. So it's actually very sweetly written, but so you can see that they are perfectly like it. I think at once they were nostalgic for all those things, um, and they were also aware of how, when they were restored, that these were the things that would win them back would win them the hearts of the people. Because actually, I think the common people, like the lower rungs, were always more on the royalist team. The Puritans had more support in kind of middle and the rising middle classes, and some members of the upper classes as well. So this idea of restoration, I think, is very important for James, because he was very conscious when he became king in 1685 that he should continue to implement his brother's restoration, and in particular that he should implement what had been promised to people and never fulfilled, because Charles wasn't able to get religious toleration past the Cavalier Parliament, actually. And this is so once he was restored, he made a promise. He made a promise before he was restored that there would be, he said, for tender consciences, there would be a, um, a religious toleration, meaning that, and this is very important, that people should be allowed to practice, whether Catholic or Protestant dissenter, as long as they didn't challenge the government. And that was an important distinction, of course, because a lot of these, you can't really separate out religion from a challenge to the government, and during the English Civil War, because you had, particularly the Presbyterians and Puritans, had ideas about religion that would directly affect governance. For example, whether or not you were going to have bishops, and that was a major thing. So, as James I famously said, "Bishops crown kings." So you can't not have bishops in his view. So this policy was James's baby, and he was very intent on bringing it in. And I'll come back to that, but just I want to stress that his idea of restoration included all of these functions of kingship, which were traditional. So, for example, the touching for the king's evil. Are you familiar with that?
I vaguely, but if you could
Yeah, sure.
explain.
So it's a practice that we know at least goes as back as Edward the Confessor. And essentially, it was believed that if the king touched a sufferer from the king's evil, which is scrofula. I don't know all the features of scrofula, but I believe there's some. It's like affects the skin, among other things. But so the tradition was that the king all these scrofula sufferers would show up, and the king would touch them and then give them a gold piece that had an angel on it, and that they could pierce the piece and wear it around their neck. And so there was this association between kingship and healing. And so it's quite interesting to note like which kings practice this and which don't. And there's also, you can compare it to, washing the feet of the followers at Christmas, at Easter rather, which the kings would also do. They would also wash feet like our priests do. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot, yeah, and a lot of these practices, of course, they're Catholic in customs and attached to old Catholic ways, because they go back to Edward the Confessor, and those are the kinds of things that Puritans tended to go after because they were vestigial Catholic practices, right? So James was very much intent on emphasizing the sacred and mystical nature of monarchy, in part through those kinds of practices. So he Charles did that as well, and James was very careful to bring in to do whatever he could to emphasize those things. And so when he was coronated on St. George's Day, 1685, which is April 23rd, he he had a special book made, which you can see online. It's beautifully illustrated, special coronation book in which he detailed every sort of detail. Sorry, he listed every detail, every custom that could be sort of remembered by anybody associated with a coronation. And I think Charles's Charles II's coronation was a little less, was a little more stripped down than this one.
Hmm.
But James's was going to be as traditional, as beautiful, as captivating and sort of transcendent as possible. And to emphasize this side of kingship, which he knew very well. Well, he believed in it strongly, and he knew that that affected the hearts of the people. So um, now, one of the things that he had going for him was his wife, Mary of Modena, who was his second wife, and she was an Italian member of the d'Este family, which is a very great Italian Catholic family. Uh, Great patrons, warriors, saints like Saint Beatrice d'Este, and and she was very like beautiful and had a very regal air about her and very lovely, very popular. And so she was crowned beside him, and she was um, the first queen to be crowned, I think, since Anne Boleyn, um, in her own right, but as
As consort.
consort. Yeah, yeah. Ironic that she was the first since Anne Boleyn, because there is this there is this pairing, right, between James and Henry VIII. I think we went over how there was a connection between him and James's conversion, and that he wanted to, he realized that Henry had converted for the become Protestant for the wrong reasons, and James saw himself as this kind of corrective to Henry VIII and his break with the Catholic Church, his terrible policies, and so on.
And he saw his similar weaknesses and sins within Henry VIII. But yeah,
That's
so if you want to get more into that discussion, if you want more of that, I will have a link to our previous video. So we um, we
great.
talked more in depth about that there. So about just with sort of James II's vision
Mm-hmm.
of religious toleration. Um, it seems to me that his reason for doing so is because he is a Catholic, and not so much because religious toleration is a Catholic principle, which it really isn't. But that when you are a minority in a
Mm-hmm.
situation like he was, uh, that's kind of the only option that he could follow. You almost see it kind of in the most bizarre sort of taking it to a real extreme by Charles III. Now,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
religious toleration is like at the coronation was almost kind of
It's,
insane,
it's
and not
religious indifferentism, right?
or more like religious like I don't even know what it would be like, but like
It's
praising different religions, which
but it's
isn't
kind of
even
like our Christianity doesn't really matter. It doesn't. We don't want to convert anybody. No, no one's
like
there
I
better
mean,
than anybody else. But
you,
yeah, but
you I
all
mean
these other people are better than us.
you did have the Hindu prime minister
Yeah,
reading
that was weird.
uh from from the Bible, which was
Bizarre.
quite comical and uh, insane in my opinion.
Yeah, it was
And
thoroughly
then you had
unfair.
like a variety of people from various religions. I do something. I can't remember what it was exactly. Do you remember what they did?
Yeah, I don't remember. I watched it with some mounting kind of horror, but but maybe I lear- looked away at that moment. So it's a really interesting. I mean, it's an obvious sort of thing to think of in connection with this policy, and it's true. Like, it's true that it's a weird thing for a devout Catholic monarch to do, but
Hmm.
so from what I know of James, I think he did have a kind of conviction about he sort of he managed to be both incredibly devout and totally convinced of the truth of Catholicism. Think back to how much he gave up in order to be a Catholic. We talked about how he went from being this incredibly popular figure who was going to, the the Duke of York, the battler of the Fire of London, the vanquisher of the Dutch, and all this. And people would not have objected to him becoming king, but he decided to convert, which was very awkward for his brother actually, because his brother also wanted to convert, but he wanted to handle it in this very subtle way. But
The
James was not like
deathbed
that.
way.
Yeah, the deathbed way, which don't try this at home because you never know when death is going to come
Yeah,
for you, right?
that's a gamble.
Yeah,
Charles II was a gambler, and he won. Like
yeah,
he, yeah.
yeah. But so we know that James was incredibly convinced as a Catholic. He was not, he didn't believe, that it doesn't matter which religion you are. He could have given up at any time because all these people came to him, like different Anglican um, bishops came to him to try to convince him to change his mind. He later was, people joked that he gave up three kingdoms for a mass. But he did talk at length about the conscience, and I think part because he himself was a convert and he knew what the sort of understood the operations of conscience and believed he had a lot of respect for the human conscience, just qua conscience. So he did. I believe there was some sincerity in his vision of a toleration which would allow everybody essentially to practice their own religion. I mean, it actually sounds a bit like a slightly unrealistic plan,
Bit.
um, but yeah, and considering how it wound up, I guess it was kind of an unrealistic plan. But but poor James. But he thought that he could win people to the Catholic faith by a good example, and that was what he said when he first called Parliament. He made this speech in which he said very ingenuously that, of course, he wanted everybody to convert to Catholicism. He wanted his people to become Catholic, but he wasn't going to try to compel them. He was going to try to set an attractive example and sort of, allure them to over and there is something attractive about that idea that you bring people, they come, you create something magnetic, and they're attracted. So the toleration, is true, had like a political dimension to it because, as you noted, Catholics were a minority. It's We don't know exactly their numbers at the time because there was a sort of blurry area of certain kinds of crypto Catholics and high church Anglicans who kind of were Catholic in you know instinct, but they were like they avoided getting in trouble, and then so there's a big difference between people who were really practicing secretly and those who were, kind of on the fence. So, I mean, Hilaire Belloc thinks that he estimates the Catholic population quite high. Um, I think most historians say it was around 7% at the time, but Hilaire Belloc thinks it was more. So, I think that's an instinct, maybe an instinctive thing, like 20%.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it is quite interesting because, we'll talk about, I want to talk about sort of a comparison with Mary the first bit, but
yeah,
uh she was like his, and this is probably might skew people's perceptions of like whether or not there were many Catholics at the time, is that for the longest time there was this belief that the Marian church was unsuccessful, that it actually turned people off to Catholicism.
it's not really
But
true, though.
what
Oh yeah, I think that's probably not. Yeah, we definitely thought that, didn't we? Or we were told that, but it may not
but
be
all
the case.
evidence
Yeah,
is to the contrary,
yeah,
through recent studies of the time period.
yeah.
It shows a devout population excited for the opportunity. It shows a low level of um, Protestant holdouts, though very fierce Protestant holdouts,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
a low percentage. Which and that everyone talks about sort of the burnings, but they were very small compared to the executions of Elizabeth.
Yes, and
Um,
those under Henry, of course, as well, which were more anybody who, the Pilgrimage of Grace would be an example. I mean, anybody who opposed his reforms.
well, almost anyone could get executed in Henry VIII's time,
Yeah,
because you could be a radical Protestant and you could get executed, and you could be a fervent Roman Catholic and
yeah,
you'd also get executed. So Henry VIII was almost all over the place with executions. It's just kind of like his personality, but but the it, it seems like there could be a possibility of a larger percentage of Catholics just based on how successful the Marian Restoration was, uh, even though historians have tried to uh, cover that up for a long time.
yeah, yeah. It's. Um, I've said this before, but I'll just quickly say it again now that there in Whig history, which of course is the historical model that we inhabit, this kind of idea that we're progressing towards this democracy or whatever, model that they favor, and all the we just sort of study history as examples of people who did or did not advance the cause of progress towards this model, right? So then we get people like Mary the First, Charles the First, and James the Second are the villains of Whig history, right? Because
Well, what would James II be?
that's
Is
sorry, James. Did I not see James the
Oh,
Second?
sorry,
Right? Yeah,
Charles II. What would Charles
yeah.
II be? Sorry.
Charles is he's I think because of his you know his personality and his kind of he's presented as a cynic and as somebody who didn't care about religion, and it's true that he was great, like he was sybaritic. I mean, he was very addicted to pleasure, but the he is not indifferent to religion the way that we are told.
Mhm.
And if you watch like a popular film about Charles II, like there was pretty good. I think it was called Restoration. It was actually a pretty good film with Rufus Sewell. I think it was a series actually as Charles. However, it presents James as this annoying religious person who's always being uptight and religious about stuff, and Charles is adorable because he doesn't care about religion. That's so stupid, that kind of. I mean, I say it was
Okay.
good only because it looks good. Like, and actually, there's a moment in it that's kind of cool where Charles sends Parliament home because they um, keep trying to block James from the succession, and eventually Charles just gets fed up with them and sends them home, and rules as an absolute monarch for the remainder of his reign. So it's kind of fun in that respect, and
Is
it's an interesting, like,
is that last part true or no?
yes, yeah, it is true. It is true.
Okay.
So those kind of things about Charles, that he actually was he loved to debate and discuss religion. He wanted to convert to Catholicism. He was, I think, his the way um, he didn't like hardcore Protestants, and he didn't take Anglicanism very seriously as a religion. So I think um, he was kind of disrespectful in church, and so he came across as somebody who just um, you know didn't respect religion, but actually he had a deep abiding love for Catholicism. But he wasn't able to. He at one point he entertained the idea with Louis XIV's help of actually deciding that the whole country was going to become Catholic again. He was the one who wanted to do that. So,
So
however, the
is James almost half measures then?
yeah, yeah, compared to what I mean, James was actually the one who tried to do it in a more kind of politic, subtle way. So it's a little more complicated than we think, right? So
Yeah.
there was a time when James Charles was seriously considering this idea that he was going to use French money and army to back up his plan. That didn't happen, but it was something that he considered. However,
A
so
a sort of revert a opposite version of, like, the, Glorious Revolution,
yeah, yeah,
kinda like a glorious restoration,
yeah,
more or less.
glorious restoration where he just kind of like completely goes for it. But
But also, like, I mean, just saying, like, with French troops versus Dutch troops,
yeah,
because
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Dutch troops will be used in the
The
Inglorious
Inglorious
Revolution.
Revolution, yeah,
Uh,
and that swept under the rug the fact how much force was actually used during the Inglorious Revolution, right? So we get this, we get such a propagandistic version of history, which I suppose that's just what states do with their history. But um, since we don't, since we oppose the state version of history, we have to like dig deeper. And so, we get a general like. It's funny about like Henry VIII, even though he's clearly a tyrant, he kind of gets like he's still presented as the ultimate king or something like that, right?
well, it kinda
Um,
has to be for sort of he's in some way the origin of the British
yeah,
state's power.
yeah,
Like, uh, where else does the British state get its power except for basically Henry VIII's decisions?
yes, yeah. So he's the one. He's like this Caesar, Caesar Pope figure who glums everything together and gives himself this this power, but and he's the one who breaks with Catholicism, and so he gets he gets all sorts of plaudits for having done that. And then of course his wives make things interesting, so people like to learn about that. Um,
Well, the
but
irony is that Henry VIII seems to me more like a just kind of a sort of like a crazy, depressed Catholic. More or less like he didn't like. I don't think he disbelieved it.
no, I don't
Like
think you did. Yeah, I agree.
there's
Yeah,
no real evidence that he did because he didn't change. He didn't actually make the. He just seemed like somebody who gets angry at the church, like
yeah,
how lapsed Catholics or even a believing Catholic who is disappointed or like frustrated by something, how they might react in anger. With his temperament, with his personality type,
yeah.
that is very uh, dangerous because he had a very dangerous temperament.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And I mean, he made life hell for his people and for his family. I'm actually reading quite a good novel by Alison Weir about Mary the First right now, which is um, quite charitable to her. So that's nice. So yeah, I agree that I think Mary the First was actually her, plan to bring back Catholicism was was realistic at the time. And her just she had it was unfortunate that she didn't have children, and
Yeah, that she died, and
yeah,
yeah, and she was
I'm
just
gonna
too old. I mean, Henry VIII
yeah
didn't marry her, like, didn't
he,
have her married,
he should
which
have
is
married
the
her off younger.
which is the
Yeah,
real, I think that's the greatest almost sin of Henry VIII.
I
Uh,
agree.
almost because it's not just cutting people away from the present, like cutting people down at the present, but also taking away their future.
Yeah, yeah. No, he was really unkind to her, and to everybody. Um, he could have, it's almost like just through this pride that he didn't want to be like he wanted to be the one that produced the male heir, and not give her a chance, at least, while she was still young. I mean, he
Even though
could have had both.
he could have also picked her bra or sorry, her husband, her bridegroom. Like he
Yeah.
could have he like it kind of baffles the mind. Though I haven't studied Henry VIII enough to understand fully why, but it just seems bizarre.
Yeah, he could have married her. Well, the real one is that people think, are wistful about, is Reginald Pole, that
Mm,
who became the cardinal. But earlier, and he was there was an idea to. I think Catherine of Aragon wanted her to marry Reginald Pole. The problem with that was that he was a Plantagenet
I was
on his
gonna say
mother's side, I believe. Yeah.
that would have basically revived the Plantagenets in a really weird way.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think he didn't want to do that because he was insecure about the Tudors being kind of the newer family, at
yeah.
least. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy. But did James the second have like an opinion of Mary the First? Did he express any of his opinions about that? And did he have a sort of a false understanding of her reign? Because I imagine that he wouldn't have gotten like like the type of information that we have now, or
So
maybe he did.
my impression, like I've come across his reaction to the book we discussed last time by Peter Halen on the Reformation, where the book he read where he that changed his mind. He mentions Mary by name in his response when he writes about it. He mentions how that she was treated unfairly by Henry. I haven't come across him writing specifically about her reign, but her image was employed by the Whigs, who, again, for people like using this term Whig history, but Whigs and Tories were formed around the question of James II's, whether he was going to be able to succeed or not, given the fact that he'd converted. And the Whigs were the ones who opposed it, and the Tories were the ones who supported James. So the Whigs were um, they were the ones who created the term Bloody Mary, uh, which was not a popular term until the latter half of the 1600s. Um, that specific term, anyway. She was criticized a lot by Fox and Fox's martyrs, but that specific term Bloody Mary comes to us from the James II period.
Really?
Um,
Hmm.
yeah, it's interesting, right? Because that, again, like that's a very popular, well-known term, and it's tied up to the Inglorious Revolution, like very, very tightly. So the idea was that, like, there are all these pamphlets that came out saying, "Oh, there's a Catholic heir. It's going to be Mary. It's going to be Bloody Mary all over again. There's going to be, Protestants are going to be burned left, right, and center. And this is what's going to happen as soon as he comes back." And so he was fighting this narrative, um, and he, I think his as far as his main emphasis was at that, he knew that in her time it might have been possible. What she tried, what was more realistic, because the Protestant Revolution hadn't advanced so far by that time, and but he was not going to try to legislate the people back in one, and he would mention her, like, not like Mary, but I have another plan, and my plan is to um, free the people to, practice. So that means restoring Catholics. Now, Catholics had been, so James is criticized for promoting Catholics in the government and making Magdalen College, Oxford, bringing it back under a Catholic president, but or dean, not sure the term, but master, I guess. Uh, but the thing is, he he knew better than anybody how badly Catholics had been treated over the previous 10 years. And he knew that that was partly because of him, since he converted, and there was this panic about Catholicism. And there was the Popish plot hoax where there was the fake claims that there was a plan to poison the king and put James on the throne. And all these people were executed, and all these Catholics were unjustly imprisoned and executed, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Quite a lot of them for no reason. And also, there were a bunch of like the recusant laws were enforced very harshly. There were new measures brought in. So James was trying to restore the Catholics because of the injustice of this, right? That there had been this horrible crackdown on them, which he felt he was partly, well, to blame for in a sense, right? By drawing attention to them. So that was why why he started promoting people. But he wasn't only promoting Catholics. But the thing is, if you do anything for Catholics, you have this like ferocious, reaction. Also, the Whigs, I honestly don't think that the Whigs cared about religion as much as their predecessors, the Puritans, did, but they knew how useful it was, like to scare people.
Well, we in the book you talk about the Tories. The Tories take power, or strong power in the Parliament
Yeah.
during James II's reign. Is the heart of the problem the Tories, not the Whigs, in this whole situation? Because it seems like James actually made a lot of like friends with Whigs, like in the weirdest way. He had a lot of Whig connections. He was friendly with William Penn. I don't know if he was exactly a Whig, but he was, closer to a Whig probably than a Tory.
Yeah, it's his friendship with William Penn is really remarkable, and that's another thing that I think underlines his true. I guess just the word liberal is obviously very coded, right? But I think he had a liberality, a generous nature when it came to um, the
Not
again
libertine.
not liberal. Well, he was kind of a libertine when he was at one stage, but he didn't endorse libertinism, right?
Okay.
So he wasn't like
But not by governance. He wasn't libertine in
he
governance.
wasn't a libertine or a liberal in terms of governance. The Whigs were, proto liberals. The John
Hmm.
Locke, the famous John Locke, was of their number, and it's amazing how directly involved John Locke was with the Inglorious Revolution. He was like, this was his, project really. And there's another one who's, I keep forgetting his name, but he was executed in the Rye House plot, which actually was a true effort to kill James and Charles, and there were several. And he is often cited. I'm going to find his name. He is often cited by American revolutionary types, like in American Revolutionary history. He
Hmm.
is um, he is mentioned a lot because he was a Republican. Um, so
Locke was, right?
Locke was, and then this other fellow whose name I keep
Oh,
forgetting,
okay.
but he was actually executed in the after the Rye House plot,
I don't.
and Locke ran away.
Interesting. Okay. Because
Um,
where was Locke living? Locke fled. Where did he
he fled
flee?
into Holland.
Holland.
So
Okay.
Holland was the camp and base camp for like all those who opposed James, and just like Protestant um, experimenters and sort of usually like kind of hardcore Protestants generally would would the Catholics would go and hang around in Flanders
Man.
because Flanders was,
Oh.
and the Protestants would hang around in Holland.
What about
Um,
France? I thought they hung around in France too.
France too, yeah, yeah. They had a network of monasteries and convents and all manner of things in both countries. And that's a very interesting subject, just like the whole English network in northern France and in Flanders. But so it's kind of a mirror world, for the the two camps. Like each one had their outposts,
Yeah.
So John Locke, after the Rye House plot was discovered, a lot of people were rounded up and some executed, and so Locke fled the country at that time. And this other fellow, who is a favorite of American revolutionaries, also was executed. I'll put it in the once I find it, I'll put it in the show notes or something in the comments. Yeah, so the Tories, right? The thing is that the Tories started out as James's friends, but then they became the fly in the ointment because um, they like they were mostly high sort of or just Anglicans, and they like said, okay, well, we're not happy that you've converted, but you are the legitimate heir to the throne, and so we believe that's more important than this matter of your religion, and we're just going to try to convince you to be Anglican. But they weren't willing to, you know, they weren't willing to, to cut off the oak tree again, as it were, right? Um, and that's why their emblem, the original Tory emblem, is the oak tree,
Hmm.
uh, which
But
isn't
then they
very.
cut it off anyways.
They do it all the time, yeah, yeah. So the Tories have not stopped um, taking on whatever policies of the opposing party that they need to in order to survive. So they started it early on by abandoning James, because, and to be fair, James's plan was maybe not the best for them, right? Because he's saying, okay, well, now we're going to have a religious toleration, and your special position as the established Church of England is going not to be, you're not going to lose your church, but you're going to have a lot of competition, right? And also the king isn't an Anglican, so it kind of leaves them in a weird, position.
Do you think in a weird way they would have responded better to a Mary or what Charles II was thinking about approach? Kind of
Just
like
being like told, that's it,
like
you're
this is going back, you
yeah,
know, you can hop on board or not, but this ship's going, with or without you.
yeah,
Kind of
yeah,
like
I think,
if you want to stick your heels, like because obviously forced, like we're not talking about forced conversions. Mary the first didn't perform first conversions. It was just more like incentives. The
yeah,
incentives were reversed back to
yeah,
what they were, which is proper Catholic governance is making the Catholic Church the incentivized as being the truth, because you need to
yeah.
recognize the truth. And in some ways maybe they would have responded better to you know that kind of means. What do you think about that? Or was it just, or were they just too powerful? Did they
I
need
mean,
French troops? Is that what it needed?
maybe I think there would have been. I think there probably would have been some kind of uprisings if they'd tried to just declare. So probably, this is always a tricky thing, that whatever you wanted to do, they seem to need backup troops from somewhere, and then that was always going to cause difficulty. So during the English Civil War, at one stage Charles I wanted to bring in Irish troops, and that in itself practically wrecked him, because when it went around that there were going to be Irish troops who are going to come in and cut everyone's throats, and
Which is
um,
kind of hilarious because he was king of Ireland. Like
yeah,
it
yeah,
wasn't even like, he was calling in like
foreigners, right? Yeah,
foreigners in the sense of like foreign to like his
yeah,
rule. I think one of the big mistakes by George III was bringing in Hessians in the American Revolution. But Hessians are far different from the Irish. Like
you're right.
like the Irish are neighbors basically. The Hessians
Yeah,
are like Germans. That's kind of Irish, and that's not the same thing.
yeah, yeah. It's a whole other people. Yeah, the Irish have always been had this strange position of being like, you know, yeah, you know,
But also they were Catholic, so it just kind of
that was it. That was the problem, really. I
that
think.
was the main problem. Not really ethnic difference in that case. It was just a
Really,
religious
yeah.
um
And,
anyway. Yeah. But so why is England always the sort of the centerpiece of all of these, like James II's sort of fall and stuff like that? Like what's happening in Scotland? What's happening in Ireland? Shouldn't Ireland be like the ideal, you know, uh be ideal situation for him at this
well,
point?
he did go to Ireland when after he went into exile, which is a whole yeah a whole story. Um,
But like, why
because
didn't
it
he surround himself? Like, why didn't he have more of a, like, I don't know, embrace sort of the Irish
just
in
go to Ireland and be the king of Ireland.
no, not necessarily that. Just because I mean, he has three kingdoms. They're
Hmm.
all more somewhat united. Was
Yeah,
there an attempt to bring in Irish troops? Like he could have brought in Irish troops.
yeah. I think that again, that had happened with
So
so James
yeah.
didn't. Okay, we're getting to the part where um, William of Orange invaded,
Well,
which
I'm
is what
actually not
happened.
talking about that in
Okay.
theory. I'm saying like if he wanted to really take like be a full monarch,
Yeah.
be truly in control, and much like Mary the First, why did he not use, or why was Ireland, why was Irish, uh, his people of Ireland not
Used.
use? And also, what was the status of Ireland? Was Ireland given back to the Irish, or not Irish, to the Catholics during James II's reign?
Not per. It's there were there were different factions. Um,
Okay.
yeah, and James had mixed like he thought that that the Irish had something to learn from the English, in terms of like for economical for in terms of
Okay.
development basically. And he wanted to, he was worried about the hatred that that the Irish felt for the English, and which whether it's legit or not is a different question, right? But he
Was
was
that
a bit,
still like firm at that time?
it was pretty firm because of
Oh,
the English Civil War period in
Cromwell.
the 60s. Yeah, Cromwell. Yeah,
Oh,
so
yeah.
that was the thing that kind of messed it all up during the Civil War period, was that when Charles I wanted to use these strongly royalist supportive Irish Catholics, but the Catholics and Protestants, the settlers in Ireland, were like fighting, and there was a uprising of the Catholics against the settlers, and
Hmm.
I believe a lot of people were killed, and that was very, there were a lot of pamphlets circulated over England, and we actually have like one of the original. You know how it's quite common for atrocity stories about babies being murdered. We see it today with like, you know, whether, and just leaving aside the question of whether it's reflects like
Real.
real or not. They're
Yeah.
used very effectively. The images of of babies murdered, or is used very effectively in war propaganda. And so there is a famous pamphlet that shows like a baby on the end of a pitchfork, and
Ugh.
that was from the Irish uprising. So you
Okay.
have the yeah you have these like complicated tensions. So some of it is like pure ethnic. So there is the ethnic differences between Irish and English. So we look similar, we look the same, right? Basically, we speak roughly the same, but the Irish are still a fairly distinct ethnic group. I mean, they have their own language, which is
Definitely.
mostly, they have their own traditions. They see themselves. I mean, they have their own island. They see themselves as
Well, don't
as
tell the northern. Don't tell that to
to the Northern Irish.
the
Yeah,
Northern Irish versus the
yeah,
Southern Irish.
yeah. That's a whole. But I mean, the thing is that the Northern Irish, like the Orange men, this whole like ethnicity becomes firmed up in the period following the Inglorious Revolution, because those were the people who supported William of Orange. And when James and William finally duked it out, they actually fought in Ireland, and we still see the effects of this today, right? Those and I think that one of the reasons that James II is not well known, and his story is brushed under the rug so much, you know, because not only is he the villain of Whig history, but he also, the outcome of these wars still is quite sensitive today, in Britain, because the outcome affected what happened in Ireland, what still persists in Ireland, right? So when the famous Orange Parade happens on July 14th every year, maybe that's 12th, maybe. The 14th is Bastille Day, isn't it? They are marching through to celebrate their having won the Battle of the Boyne, and this was James II, when James II lost to William of Orange, right? So and they carry banners of Cromwell. They go through Catholic neighborhoods, like, you know, and so these things are still very sensitive. They are bound up with all the IRA kind of
Hmm.
history and all that stuff, right? So I think that one of the reasons it's not taught as much as it is that it still affects people directly today, right?
Well,
So
that's kind of, in some sense, I mean, Whig history. A lot. I mean, the Glorious Revolution, the Inglorious Revolution, as it should be, is an important block that society is held up by,
yeah, yeah, it's like the
especially in
foundation
Britain.
piece. Yeah, it's the foundation of the present order.
Yeah, it's a foundation. It's kind of like why everyone gets. I mean, it's not. It's much farther back than World War II, so it's not as
Yeah, it's not as
visceral
as
of a
visceral as World War
response.
II. Yeah,
But but it does, if it crumbles, uh, then you don't have a legitimate king.
king. Yeah,
Like there's
yeah,
the whole, basically there's no such thing as a prime minister then.
yep. There's no prime minister. There's no legitimate king. The setup of Ireland, it comes into question. Um, Scotland is also another thing that comes into question, because
The unity,
the
yeah,
unity matter. Yeah, like
one
James,
parliament.
yeah, the one parliament thing. So that actually came in under Anne, who was
Hmm.
James's daughter, but a very disloyal daughter. Uh, One who, by the way, regretted her behavior with her father, and she apologized for it. And she did consider restoring her, trying to get her brother, Prince James Francis Edward, included, and succeed her instead of George the First, which is like when George the First, the House of Hanover were brought in. That really cemented this, new model of kingship that we have. And
the, the new model of not being in control because you don't even speak English.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're just this. I mean, it's so different, right? Like being an actual, visible, legitimate, accountable monarch, which is what James was, what Charles II was, you know, as opposed to somebody who's just there really on the coins, stamping things and just representing um, the true sovereign, which became Parliament. So Parliament became sovereign as they wished to be. Now you could argue that NGOs are in some misty, sort of confusing assemblage of groups like that are sovereign.
Interest groups,
Yeah,
power, money. Money
lobby
is
groups. Yeah,
money's sovereign,
yeah,
more or less.
yeah. So this, you know, this model that, we're kind of bringing back out, trying to bring back out into the sunlight here, is like the opposite, of what we're supposed to want, and what is considered, good, reasonable, type of governance. Um, the, the key incident is the birth of James's son. This is the thing that actually toppled him effectively, and that's like the great irony of this whole story, is that usually, we have, going back to Henry VIII, we have somebody who turned everything upside down trying to get a male heir, and a male heir, of course, is the thing that normally secures a dynasty.
Hmm.
James, the birth of James's son was the thing that effectively toppled him, because it meant a Catholic succession, and that frightened a lot of people who were already frightened, right? Or already, frightened, or let's say, unwilling to countenance this, right?
Hmm.
So, um, when James and Mary of Modena were crowned, there was a lot of people thought that they should just, their role was really just to keep the throne warm for James's daughter Mary, who was married to William of Orange. So that's why William of Orange is has so much power in this situation.
Well, he became sort of the lead. He led his wife. His
Yeah,
wife was not really in control.
yeah. His She was happy for him to do it, to take over and to do all the, all the invading part, and then she came along in his wake. But she was the one who, everyone could point to as the legitimate Protestant heir. Um, and then there was Anne, was her next youngest daughter. So James's daughters had been raised Protestant at Charles's insistence. That's another thing you could say, was this a good idea or not? Charles thought it would keep the Parliament happy, just to like, so they, Charles did know how freaked out people got when Catholics seemed to be, coming anywhere near the throne. And
Well,
when I
yeah,
say
it's interesting. Just on that topic of like, it seems like from what I understand, Charles II was good at balancing and playing people against each other,
yeah,
playing powerful people against each other. It seems like James II was not very good at playing people against each other, which
yeah,
I like. It's interesting that he kind of tries to make friends with everybody in some ways, but in some ways, uh, that's not as good as playing people off of each other. Would that be a good
yeah. It's kind of,
kind of
it's like he wasn't a Machiavellian. He and we
yeah,
can say in one way that means that it means he was maybe a better man
human,
in
better
some ways,
person.
but
Yeah,
yeah, but not a
guy.
better leader, which is unfortunate. I mean, he
Like
was
he just,
certainly a great military leader, but yeah.
but it's also like, was he too optimistic of conscience? Was he too optimistic of the human soul? Basically,
Yeah, I mean, we can just. I think he was. I think he. I think people are unnecessarily hard on James. He had many, and they want to justify his being deposed.
mhm.
However, I mean, if we're realistic, we can say, well, he didn't manage to hang on to power, and that is a problem, right? Like,
Yes,
for a leader, you know, he did not succeed at that level. He succeeded in being the leader of a movement in exile, and it one thing we notice. Well, I know we're going to probably talk more about this another time with the other people, but just that the fact that the Jacobite movement in James's time was actually a very powerful movement. There were many times when it looked as though he would be restored. He had a lot of support. Uh, William of Orange lost support rapidly when people found out. First of all, they realized they were being ruled by a foreign power, and secondly, he was he just wanted to rule England so he could divert all these resources into his fight with France, and that's what he did. He raised taxes very high. he got a bunch of Englishmen fighting the French, where when actually the French and English had been on better terms for quite a while. So that was, we think of England as always being fighting the French, but actually part of that was William of Orange like brought us back to that, where you know under the Stuarts we were on better terms with the French.
And
Yeah,
it seems to me that the under the Stuarts, there would have been a lot more isolationism, not getting involved in as many foreign wars that the Hanovers uh, and William III
yeah,
got them into, because I can't see how there'd be I don't see why there'd be a part in like the wars against the Holy Roman Emperor. I don't
yeah.
see that being a thing with James II or any of the Stuarts going
I mean,
forward.
this war war in this period is a you need parliament to wage war, and if you don't want to call parliament because they're so politically ambitious and difficult, which they were, especially in this period, that means peace. Actually, so under Charles I, he had the period that he considered was called the personal monarchy, which is an 11-year period when he didn't call parliament,
Hmm.
um, because and he had to stay out of European wars, you know, and there was quite a peaceful period. But eventually, he had to call them again, and that was his downfall. That they call that the tyranny, right? But
Hmm.
but it's actually a fairly pleasant, quiet period. Same with the later Stuarts, like if they wanted to get involved with wars, they would have needed Parliament's cooperation. And so James was always telling Charles, "Look, let's not get into this war." Like they fought with the Dutch, but after that, he was kind of telling Charles, "Let's keep out of this, let's keep out of that," because they didn't want to call Parliament back, right? They had so many problems with them. Like it was, it was just the particularly the late 1670s with the Popish plot hoax and the way that Parliament, like at least the difficult faction in Parliament, worked with the mob in London, and how there's this synergy, and they were constantly like parading around, and you know the circus that is democratic politics today. You can see it's in its infancy in this period, right? And
Hmm.
so like all the kind of lies and the media, the way the media is used, the way the people are manipulated, the way the media grows like in tandem with the political parties, and with the growth of the vote. The more the vote spreads to people, the more the elites feel they have to inform everybody by like you know
Brainwashing.
brainwash them, yeah, with bombarding them with media all the time. And there's like that. So like pamphlets, other forms of like official magazines, and there's like all these weird protests, like anti-Catholic protests, burnings in effigy, just constant like madness going on.
Hmm.
And it and I will I will, like, because I know we don't have much more time, but I will conclude sort of just this discussion by pointing to what happened when James's wife was pregnant.
Hmm.
Every time she got pregnant, because they didn't know what the sex was, they would immediately start a story that there was going to be a supposititious heir, that there was going to be, in other words, like a fake baby, a changeling. So they kind of tapped into this lore about the changeling left by fairies. It was like a weird, creepy baby that wasn't the real baby. And so there were a lot of gossip and pamphlets and stories and pictures and medals and all sorts of stuff churned out to throw kind of doubt around the legitimacy of the baby, because it's all about legitimacy, right? Like the power of the king is the legitimacy, the tradition, the the sanctity, the mystery, the air of the deep roots, and the 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 way to battle against that is to cast out and ridicule. So ridicule, and people know anything about the 18th century, which is coming. That is the that is like the dominant tone of the 18th century, is harsh satire, harsh, weird uh, cartoons, political cartoons. And I think that goes hand in glove with this need to delegitimize the tradition, right? So
Mhm.
to delegitimize the church and the and the monarch, and how those two are, traditionally interwoven. You have to use um, this weapon of ridicule to destroy that. Um, and that's what we see happen here, is that this child from like, and it's significant that it happened every time she got pregnant, right? Because it wasn't just this one time that as soon as she got pregnant, there was this story that would start up. So the last time she'd gotten pregnant, it turned out to be a girl. The girl eventually died. But as soon as they found out it was a girl, the stories just disappeared. So, they would start the stories anticipating a possible boy, because a boy would, of course, be more, go to the front of the line.
Legitimate heir. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when they found out that it was a legitimate heir, they wheeled out this like story, ludicrous story about the baby being introduced in a warming pan, right?
Yeah.
Which is like a maid coming in with a copper warming pan, which is like flat like this, and it's the stupidest idea ever. But I think that's the point: is that it's ridiculous. It makes something that is like mysterious and sacred, the birth of a royal child. It makes your
Ridiculous.
brain, yeah, it
Yeah.
makes it ridiculous, and it makes your mind go like to like violate the sacred space mentally, and laugh at what you're supposed to be
Hmm.
um, respectful towards, and so that's what happened to James Francis Edward Stewart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But let's talk about sort of church, the Churchill.
Okay. Oh
Um,
yes.
um, I can't John Churchill, right? The future Duke of Marlborough.
Yeah.
Now, tell me just about his betrayal, because the thing that James II seemed to fail most on during the Inglorious Revolution was his ability to keep his generals together.
Yeah.
Like, if he had kept his generals, he would have been fine. That's kind of what I can gather. But
Yeah. Yeah. So he had this young boy who he had brought up from a page. So he had brought him into his household when he was Duke of York. His father was named Sir Winston Churchill, maybe a familiar name to some people. He
it's funny,
he
Churchills are always at the
Yep,
building block or
the
of,
Whig history, yeah,
yeah.
and state like regime history, right? um, and and he was incredibly helpful to this young man. He helped him, uh, his in his career. He brought him up. He gave him a title. You know, John Churchill was his right hand man, and he married this girl called Sarah, who became she's the in the movie, the if people have seen The Favorite, she's the first favorite, Sarah Churchill. She was this really bright, witty woman known as the Queen of the Whigs, and she is an infuriating person, but a very good and hilarious writer. So if you're interested, you can read her memoirs, the memoirs of the Duchess of Marlborough, of the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough. And her account of this period is actually very interesting, because it's not as cut and dried as you would think, and she actually makes fun of William of Orange like consistently. So it's just a good read. Like, she's an interesting person, but they were a kind of a very
Power couple.
power couple, yeah. And Mary of Modena helped them get married. They did everything for these people, right? And then, but he was the one who abandoned James. So James found out that his both of his daughters abandoned his cause, and John Churchill abandoned his cause, and they'd all run off to the William of Orange's camp. And this just was like, it dealt him a psychological blow that I think he never recovered from, really. Um, he loyalty was everything to James, and unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of insight into how other people function, and that sometimes that people are just not you know not
He
as
was too
loyal.
optimistic. He was too
Yeah,
he was too much of an optimist regarding the souls of, like
yeah,
the goodness of humanity. He was, it's endearing in some ways, but it's
yeah,
frustrating and like, why could you have
yeah. Why? Yeah,
why?
yeah. Why didn't you? But
What
yeah, go ahead.
No, continue, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, they say that James had widespread support in the army, but he, as you say, he lost John Churchill, and then also Anne's uh, husband,
Husband. Who
George, Prince of Denmark,
Okay.
also went over to the other side. And I think if you look at how James felt, he just felt like he was on ice, and the ice was cracking under him, and he couldn't he couldn't rely on his generals. He didn't know who was loyal and who wasn't loyal. So he was concerned about fighting effectively another civil war on English soil. And he
Even though
also,
Yeah, even though it was Dutch troops, just, not
yeah, it's not, yeah, it
when
could have been done. It could have. Some people, really got frustrated with him and just begged him to stay and not and to fight, or just stay in the palace and just not, but he unfortunately he just he didn't recover from being betrayed by all these people, and he also, in his mind, was what happened to his father, which was that he was imprisoned and executed.
yeah.
um, and so he thought, well, also what they did was before prior, what they retreated to the continent, and they waited,
Mhm.
and then they were restored. So he thought, okay, well, let's do that.
Mm.
And he was worried about his wife and child. He was really, so he thought that the sensible thing to do would be to retreat, and then have a second restoration. I think that was.
Was his faith shaken by this? Because it seems to me that if his faith was stronger at that time, he might have stayed. Because like, I don't know, divine providence and all that.
Yeah, I I know that his faith was. It wasn't so much his faith in God, but his faith that God wanted wanted him to be the
Mm.
one, um, because he thought that his sins were so great, his libertinism, his sins of the flesh were so great, and he hadn't sufficiently atoned for those. He felt that God didn't favor him for that reason, and he continued to
Mhm.
believe that, actually. Yeah.
Okay,
Um,
that makes it so much. That makes a lot more sense because I guess his weaknesses really came to bite him,
yeah.
psychologically, not even really like, not necessarily, um, right in front of him, but just,
Yeah.
in his head. He got inside of his
Yeah.
head. But was could he have won if he had kept his army together?
I, I I think so.
Like,
Yeah,
okay,
but he
there's a
did.
shot.
Yeah, he did have, like, he did have a lot of support, just from the regular troops. Um, so it was the officers were a problem because they were so ambitious, right? The
Yeah,
common people did love him.
but
He did.
there must have been, if you're if generals are, flee, if there are
Yeah,
really ambitious people, I
you
almost
think.
think, if you there's got to be somebody who's like, okay, well, if I flee to that group, well, I'm not going to get it as big of a, bounty from
Yeah,
fighting now, because now they just got a bunch of like, people that are already going to get, the rewards. So in some ways, the biggest reward you could possibly get is by staying
staying and
loyal.
being loyal. Yeah,
Because if you were
and
loyal and all the big dogs, so to speak,
yeah,
jump ship,
then you would stand to be. Yeah.
you could
Well,
become the big dog.
we saw that when James went into exile, and he was followed by about 40,000 people. So he,
Wow, that's a lot.
yeah. So he had huge numbers from all the nations of the British Isles, and he was happy with that model because he felt like he knew who was actually loyal to him, because they came with him, and they
Yeah.
gave up a lot as well, because they would have, whenever somebody who had lands and so forth went into exile, they would often sacrifice their lands and their possessions,
Yeah,
which,
they give up everything.
yeah, yeah. So at
Um,
that stage, he at least felt that he knew who his friends were. So I mean that,
so
which is good.
is that a personal flaw, kind of sort of desiring to know who's on your side, um,
Yeah, I guess
by losing it all
yeah, I guess he
in a
just
weird
couldn't
way?
stand that feeling of, of
Yeah.
uncertainty about who, you know, who really, yeah, who is really loyal to him.
Did he buy into the propaganda too much?
Well, we
Also,
know that yeah, I mean, we know he wasn't restored, and that's the unfortunate. We all wish that he was.
yeah.
Yeah,
Now I do have
certainly.
one more question about the Duke
Hmm.
of Monmouth
Yeah,
and his rebellion. Now, would it have been, or so he rebelled. It was kind of a pathetic rebellion. No, the gentry didn't join him. It was, and he was the bastard son of Charles II.
yeah.
Um, and he sort of you know groveled at the end, trying to get mercy and stuff like that. I mean, he was executed in the end, but was that a sort of bad decision by James? In some sense, some king who grants clemency could potentially get sort of a servant for life from
I
that,
think,
or
I
was the
think
Duke of Monmouth, you know, that far untrustworthy in the future?
he'd done it too many times by this
Okay.
stage. So it was like the third time that he'd he'd had some form of rebellion against, because he all through his father's reign, the Duke of Monmouth, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, was, um, he was he had this sort of group assembled around him as a possible heir, because they were trying to give, there was a fake story that his parents had really been married and he really was legitimate, and it wasn't true. But I think what the followers were trying to do was give Charles like a chance to lie and say, yeah, actually he is my son. Like, they give him a son effectively, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think that was their plan. And so they were saying, yeah, we have this secret black box that has this secret document in it, and it secretly proves that he's really your legitimate son. And Charles was like, no, no, you don't. And um, that's ridiculous. But the Duke of Monmouth was, a very attractive, charming character, good fighter, and when he wasn't around his father, he would let people call him, Prince of Wales, and he would like
Uh,
allow people to
okay.
treat him like. And on he was involved in the Rye House plot, which is the one that John Locke was involved in, and he um, he knew well that, it happened more than once that he was involved in a serious plot, and this one was really bad. That they were planning to kill Charles and James. They were going to kidnap them and kill them, and it didn't quite work out because they left earlier than they were expecting. And so then Charles said he James actually went to bat for him on that occasion and asked Charles, okay, let's forgive him. And Charles forgave him. Then, as soon as he got forgiven, he went right back to his old ways. And so then he was banned from court for the rest of his life, and he went off to Holland. And then he did the Monmouth Rebellion, right? So he'd already had a really bad track record. And so at
Yeah.
that stage, he really couldn't, James couldn't let him get away with it that time, because
He
he was just
chose his
too,
side.
yeah.
He too many times. Okay. Yeah.
He knew no, like, people were not shocked by this. And some of the Whig historians will present this whole story as, you know, as an example of James's cruelty, because quite a few people were executed. But it was the local judge the Judge Jeffreys, who made those decisions before to execute a lot of the sort of local peasants and things who got involved in the Monmouth Rebellion. And
Sure.
James apparently didn't actually have a chance to um, to to display clemency towards those people. It was already a done deal. But but again, they did. The thing is, rebellions, people, if you got on board with a rebellion, people you could expect to get executed. That was taken pretty seriously.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Treason, it's
yeah,
not not dealt with lightly.
yeah, yeah. Some
Um,
people were like, there were some women who had been sort of involved, and they were let go. But yeah.
well, thank you for discussing this topic with me. Everyone, check out The Private Life of James II. It's out now, and I know you'll really enjoy it. I very much did. And Justine Brown, thank you for coming on. You also have a YouTube channel. What is it called again?
Justine Brown's bookshelf.
Can you tell us a little bit about it? So if anybody
So
wants to check it
so
out.
it's a history channel mainly. It's mostly about 17th century history. There's a whole. It's heavily illustrated. So there's a lot to look at, um, and there's a lot on the English Civil War. There's a whole playlist on the English Civil War and a playlist on the Jacobites. So if you want sort of an overview of this movement, that would be a good place to start. And
Do,
there's others too.
awesome. Do you have any like plans or aspirations for any future book as
I'm
well?
I have a deadline looming for a book about Mary of Modena, so
Okay.
James's queen. So that is going to be coming out with Pen and Sword, also who are the publishers.
Okay.
So they're a very they're history focused British publisher, and the books are available on Amazon, but also they should be available through Barnes and Noble and things like that in the states.
Okay,
And
awesome. And if you like this episode, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. As Justine sort of mentioned briefly, there might be hopefully a Jacobite group conversation on plot lines in the future. I'm hoping to bring some people together, and we're gonna delve into the Jacobite story. Uh, and Justine hopefully will be joining us. So thank you again, Justine. Anything to say before we go?
just thank you for having me on, and that's it really. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you. God bless everyone. Bye.
God bless.